Okay, so I am going to go ahead and start this webinar. I just want to welcome everyone and thank you so much for being here. So we are doing an undergraduate briefing series specifically on Iran. We're doing this for our comparative politics class here at our Department of History and Political Science for Vanguard University. Again, thank you so much. We worked really hard on this and hopefully you learn a lot today. So I just want to quickly go over our undergrad panelists today. So first and foremost, I want to start off with saying that we are all history and political science students here at the department, and we're all enrolled in the comparative politics course. So today we have Ella Bradley, Hana Hiramine, Morgan Marsh, Abigail Schlipp, and myself presenting. And so before we start everything, I just want to go over a quick little timeline and agenda for today's meeting. We're going to start off with a thesis over our webinar, then we're going to do a deep dive into the historical timeline of major events in Iranian history. We're going to have a breakdown of the political system and institutions of Iran. We're going to have an analysis of different political indices for Iran, then a comparative analysis with the United States and Iran, recent news and current events, and then a conclusion, some hope for democracy, and a really quick Q&A session if anyone has questions. So that's going to be the agenda for today, and I'd like to hand it off to Ella.
Hi everyone, my name's Ella, and in this webinar we'll explore how Iran's political system shapes everyday life and national well-being. To understand this relationship, we will look at several global indicators that political scientists often use to evaluate societies, including the World Happiness Report, the Democracy Index, the Gender Equality Index, and the Corruption Perceptions Index. And these indicators allow us to examine not only how governments function politically, but also how citizens experience life within those political systems. In other words, they help us connect politics with human experience. Iran today is officially known as the Islamic Republic of Iran, a political system that emerged after the 1979 Iranian Revolution. Before that revolution, Iran was ruled by a monarchy under Mohammad Reza Shah. The revolution dramatically transformed the country's political structure by replacing the monarchy with a government that blended Republican institutions with religious authority. Under this system, Iran has institutions that resemble those in many republics. The country has a president, a parliament, and national elections. However, these institutions operate within a political framework in which ultimate authority rests with the supreme leader, an unelected religious figure who wields significant power over the military, the judiciary, and key political decisions. Because of this structure, many classify Iran as a theocratic authoritarian regime. Elections exist, but political competition is limited, and many candidates must be approved by religious oversight bodies before they can run. This creates a system where political participation is structured within strict ideological boundaries. Understanding this system is important because political institutions influence much more than just government policy. They shape how individuals experience freedom, opportunity, and trust in political institutions. We can see these tensions clearly in recent events. In September of 2022, the death of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman who was detained by Iran's mortality police for allegedly violating the country's mandatory hijab law, sparking nationwide protests. The demonstration quickly spread across the country and drew international attention. For many Iranians, the protests reflected deeper frustrations with political restrictions, social regulations, and limited avenues for political participation within the country. The movement also highlighted women's role in advocating for a greater personal autonomy and equality within Iranian society. This leads to the central argument of the presentation. The core argument is that Iran's political structure directly shapes broader social outcomes, including levels of personal freedom, institutional trust, and overall well being among citizens. By examining global indicators such as the World Happiness Report or even the Democracy Index, we can better understand how political systems influence people's evaluations of the quality of their lives. Now I'm going to hand it off to Morgan.
Thank you for that, Ella. I'm going to be breaking down some modern history in Iran. The Iran's modern history is shaped by a series of dramatic turning points that reshape politics, society, and relationship with the world. We begin in 1963 when Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi launched what he called the White Revolution, which was a sweeping modernization program. It promises land reform, expanded education, women's suffrage, and rapid industrial growth. But while the Shah presents it as progress, many Iranians see it as forced top-down change that deepened inequality and eroded traditional structures. Opposition grew, especially among religious leaders. By 1979, that tension erupted. Protests swept the country, the Shah fled Iran, and Ayatollah Khomeini returned from exile to a hero's welcome. Within months, the monarchy collapsed and the Islamic Republic is established. The new government consolidated its power and anti-Western sentiment surged. That same year, Iranian students seized the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, triggering a 444-day hostage crisis that cemented decades of mistrust between Iran and the United States. In 1980, Iran faced a new catastrophe. Iraq invaded, launching a brutal 8-year war. The conflict devastated both nations, costing hundreds of thousands of lives. Inside Iran, the government tightened control, carrying out political purges and suppressing dissent in the name of wartime unity. By the time the war ended in 1988, the country was exhausted, but the revolutionary leadership was firmly entrenched. A shift came in 1997 when voters elected Mohammad Khatami, a reformist cleric who promised a more open society. His presidency ushered in a period of cultural and political relaxation. This included greater press freedom, a blossoming civil society, and cautious attempts at dialogue with the West. But conservative factions pushed back, limiting how far the reforms could go. Fast forward to 2018, when the United States withdrew from the Iranian nuclear deal. The return of heavy sanctions plunged Iran into a deep economic crisis. Inflation soared and the currency collapsed, and everyday life became increasingly difficult for ordinary Iranians. By the 2020s, Iran is defined by a persistent tension, a powerful state determined to maintain control, and a young, highly educated population demanding change. Economic hardship, political repression, and social restrictions fuel repeated waves of protest. Each movement, whether sparked by economic grievances, women's rights, or demand for political freedom, reveals a society still wrestling with the legacy of its revolution and the pressures of the modern world. Today, Iran stands at a crossroads, shaped by decades of upheaval, resilience, and an ongoing struggle over what its future should be. On my next slide, we're going to talk about American intervention in Iran, and we're going to walk through these major turning points. So, in 1953, the US and the UK helped to remove Prime Minister Mossadegh and restore the Shah. And then in 1979 was the US embassy crisis, which we broke down in the last slide, which is when the diplomatic ties actually ended in Iran. And then in 1980, there was the Iran-Iraq War, where the US supported Iran and Iraq and clashed with Iran, deepening the hostility there. In 2002, the US publicly labeled Iran as a major adversary, and they put it on the list of the axis of evil. And in 2015 was when the JCPOA nuclear deal was enacted, and it limited Iran's nuclear program in exchange for some economic support. But this was terminated in 2018 when we decided to withdraw, and this escalated a lot of tension going on in Iran, fueled by this economic crisis. Now we fast forward to the 2020s, where there was some escalation and assassinations, protests, and regional clashes, pushing relations into the most volatile point in decades, which is where we see ourselves today. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to be taking over and I'll be discussing political systems and institutions within Iran. So their political system is most commonly described as a theocracy. I know that this is what I've heard it described as for many years. And as you can see, the diagram on the left is showing us all of the many parts of the government because unlike our government, it doesn't only have three branches. There are a lot of different moving parts that are working in appointments and overseeing, checking and approval. And so through this diagram, you're going to see two main parts. In gray are the appointed parts of government, and in blue are the elected. And so you do have that theocracy, but there are some elements that are elected. And so that presents a sort of democracy. But because of the appointed aspects, you're really going to see the theocracy and the church aspect of things overrunning it. And so the elected elements are the remnants from before 1979, but that new government is going to come in and kind of check that power. And before we go on, I just wanted to clarify a couple terms that are going to be coming up as we go through the government structure. The first is clerics, which are religious leaders, and the second is jurists, which are experts in the law. And you're going to see this kind of throughout the structure of Iran's government, that their purpose is to ensure Islamic law. And so their right to govern, unlike ours, that we think of like the social contract and Locke and that theory of government, their right to govern comes from their ability to interpret Islamic law. And so you're going to see kind of that gap between church and state bridged throughout their government because of that rationale. And then our first aspect that we're going to be looking at is the supreme leader, who is the ultimate authority, has the final say on foreign policy, war, elections, and he has divine right because he is believed to be the key and foremost figure who is interpreting Islamic law. And so he is appointed, so there is someone to appoint him, but as we'll come to see, a lot of things end up looping back to him. He is appointed by the Assembly of Experts, and the current supreme leader is Mojtaba Khamenei, who was appointed on March 9th. He's a son of the former supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. Our second aspect we're going to be looking at is the Guardian Council, which is another appointed aspect of the government. There are 12 appointed members, 6 are appointed by the Supreme Leader, and then 6 are nominated by the Chief Justice of the Judiciary, and then they are confirmed by the Parliament. They serve 6-year terms, and all of the bills and laws that the Parliament is going to be proposing and writing, they are going to be approving. And so you have that confirmation of laws from an outside figure that is not elected. That's kind of hindering the democratic aspect of lawmaking. And then going on, we have the president and executive branch. The president is elected by popular vote for up to 2 consecutive 4-year terms. He appoints a cabinet that is going to be confirmed by Parliament and approved by the Supreme Leader. So we're coming back to the Supreme Leader even in this elected aspect. All of the applicants for president have to be approved by the Guardian Council, which is then also under the Supreme Leader. So you do see a hindrance on that electoral process because of the removal of candidates. Sometimes it can be up to hundreds of candidates who are running for president, who are then refined within the confines of the Guardian Council's idea of what the Islamic Republic is. And their current president is Masoud Pezeshkian, and he has been president since 2024. The previous president died in a helicopter crash, and then he was elected then. The next part of government is the Islamic Consultative Assembly, the Majlis, and that is a unicameral house with 290 seats. And so the Guardian Council, again, is going to be checking the electoral process within this aspect of government. It can disqualify candidates registered to run and will dwindle them down so that they are aligning again with their vision. So any party that may be in opposition or any person who may be in opposition can be removed from the ballot. They are going to be approving and then putting out the official ballot. But there are 5 seats that are reserved for non-Muslim minority groups, including Jews, Armenian Christians, Assyrian and Chaldean Christians, and Zoroastrians. And then the judiciary is headed by the Chief Justice, who is appointed by the Supreme Leader. And so you see that removal of check there. The judiciary isn't going to be able to curb the power or the choices or the decisions of the supreme leader because the head of the judiciary is appointed by the supreme leader. It lacks independence. The head of judiciary, the Chief Justice, is on the Supreme National Security Council, which is a key aspect of what the judiciary is going to be doing is kind of interpreting those laws throughout the judiciary, throughout the Supreme National Security Council. And so when the head of judiciary is also on that council, then he's interpreting the laws he's creating. And so there isn't independence there. And there's a lot of lack of transparency amongst judges, that the fact that they are appointed and the fact that the head is appointed by the supreme leader means that there will be people in a position of power who are very one-sided in their alignment and their perspective, because it's very honed in on what the supreme leader's idea of the country is. It's also really well known for its absence of due process. In the 1990s, the Chief Justice removed the office of the prosecutor so that all judges also served as prosecutors. And so then you had all of the court cases swinging in one direction because there was that denial of a fair trial. And the UN human rights coverage in 2021 said that the structural flaws of the justice system are so deep that one can barely speak of there being a justice system because of the amount of corruption that Morgan will end up touching on later in our Corruption Perceptions Index. And then the Assembly of Experts are 86 clerics chosen by popular vote. Candidates must be approved by the Supreme Leader instead of the Guardian Council in this case. And since they do monitor the Supreme Leader's work and he is approving the candidates, then the amount to which they are going to be checking his power is limited, because he is more than likely not going to be putting people through who would be checking his power. And they serve 8-year terms. And again, to some extent, monitor the Supreme Leader's works. And then to go into political parties and factions, we see factions a lot more. Article 26 of the Constitution does allow for political parties, but it says at the bottom that so long as they do not violate the principles of independence, freedom, national unity, the criteria of Islam, or the basis of the Islamic Republic. And so that really impacts which political parties are able to be there. There are opposition parties that are no longer allowed and that have been banned. So you see a lot more factions and mindsets and broader ideologies within, or more specific ideologies within one broader ideology. And so the other aspect that makes them swing more towards factions is their goal being political participation, not to win seats. So you're not looking for a political party to have a majority in a legislative branch in the same way that you see within the US. And from 1980 to 1987, you did have one political party. It's opened up to multiple, but it's again still limited by the Guardian Council and other aspects of government that are going to be checking who is allowed to move through with their party affiliations. And then to highlight the two main ideologies that we have, there's the principalists, which are also called the hardliners, the conservatives. And so they are going to be really supporting the divinity of the supreme leader and the religious aspect of the state. And so you are going to see amongst the Society of Militant Clergy of the Tehran support of censorship. They do support a free market, unlike the Association of the Devotees of the Islamic Revolution. But they are all generally supporting the religious aspect and going to be more conservative in that sense. And then the reformists, one party example is the Islamic Iran Participation Front, which are anti-imperialists. And Morgan touched on our imperialistic nature of a lot of politics within Iran are influenced by that history. And so this party is coming forward to be anti-imperialist. They are sometimes more friendly on the international relations front, but they are definitely hesitant because of the imperialistic history. They want to make it clear that Iran is its own country. And so from here, I'm going to pass it off to Ella to go over the World Happiness Index.
Hi again. My section focuses on the Iran through the lens of the World Happiness Report, one of the most widely cited global measures of well-being. The report is published annually through a collaboration between the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network, Gallup, and a network of international researchers who study quality of life across countries. What makes the World Happiness Report particularly interesting is that it moves beyond traditional economic indicators like the GDP. While economic performance is still considered, the report is primarily focuses on how people actually experience their lives within societies. To measure this, researchers analyzed several key indicators that together provide an estimate of national well-being. One important factor is social support, which assesses whether people feel they have someone to rely on during difficult times. Strong social networks and family structures are really important in Iran and often increase life satisfaction because individuals feel supported during moments of hardship. In Iran, extended family networks and close community relationships remain an important part of social life, which can provide emotional and social stability. Another factor is healthy life expectancy, which reflects how long individuals are expected to live in good health. This indicator is influenced by healthcare access, environmental conditions, and economic stability. Iran's life expectancy is relatively moderate compared to many other countries, which contributes somewhat positively to the overall well-being. A third indicator is freedom to make life choices, which measures whether individuals feel they have autonomy over the directions of their lives. This factor is particularly relevant when examining political systems. In societies where political freedom, civil liberties, and personal expression are limited, citizens may feel less control over their personal futures. This is where Iran's ranking becomes especially interesting. Iran's political system imposes significant restrictions on political participation, freedom of speech, and certain aspects of personal life, which can shape individuals' perceptions of their ability to make independent life decisions. Another factor included in the index is generosity, which looks at charitable giving and willingness to help others. Cultural and religious traditions of charity remain strong in Iranian society, particularly through religious giving practices, and these traditions can positively influence social cohesion and overall well-being. Finally, the index evaluates perception of corruption, which refers to how much citizens trust public institutions and believe government power is used fairly. The citizens perceive corruption or lack of transparency in government institutions, trust declines, and national well-being suffers. When we look specifically at Iran's ranking in the World Happiness Report, the country generally falls in the middle range, often ranking in the high 90s out of approximately 140 to 150 countries depending on the year. To understand what this means, it helps to compare Iran with different countries. For example, countries such as Finland, Denmark, and Iceland consistently rank at the top of the happiness index. These countries typically score highly because citizens report strong trust in institutions, high levels of personal freedom, economic stability, and strong social safety nets. Iran's ranking is significantly lower, which may reflect economic pressures, political restrictions, and lower levels of institutional trust. However, Iran does not rank at the very bottom of global rankings, suggesting that other social factors continue to support well-being within Iranian society. Strong family relationships, cultural traditions of community support, and deep social networks often help individuals navigate economic or even political difficulties. This creates a complex balance in which social resilience coexists with political and economic challenges. In other words, World Happiness Report shows us that well-being is not determined by economics alone. It's shaped by a combination of political institutions, social relationships, and cultural values. Now we'll be going back to Abigail.
Thank you, Ella. I'm going to be looking at the Economic Intelligence Unit's Democratization Index. So every year since 2006, the Economic Intelligence Unit has published their Democracy Index that rates countries on a scale from 0 to 10 and gives them categories between authoritarian regimes to full democracies. And so you can see Iran here on the map that is in the red and is deemed an authoritarian regime. So Iran is ranked 154 out of 167 countries with a score of 1.96 out of 10. Its score among the 5 factors is broken down with electoral process and pluralism having a score of 0. As we kind of looked at the government structure, there are some elements that hint at the possibility of democracy. The idea of elections is very democratically based, but it isn't worked out because of the check of sorts that is placed by other parts of the government. And so, especially with the Guardian Council and its ability to either to deny candidates the right to be on the or the ability to be on the ballot is going to hinder the electoral process. The ability for the government to ban opposition parties is going to hinder the pluralism that you have. And along with that, as we're going to talk about in just a little bit, there is a lot of corruption that is going to be hindering in our next category, the functioning of government, that has a score of 2.5. And there's a lack of accountability because of their idea of there being divine rule. There isn't really a rationale to have a check on that power because of the religion that is embedded within the constitution of the state and then within its leaders. It's hard to say that a leader's decision is wrong when the leader's decision is coming from the religious foundation that is amongst the culture of the country, the people within the country, and then its constitution. There's also that system of approval that is hindering the function of government because even within their legislative system, laws aren't able to be passed just by legislators. They are being checked by the supreme leader and the assembly of experts. And so that is going to prevent the government from functioning in the way that a democracy would. And then the political participation factor has a score of 3.33. Voter turnout in the 2024 election for both parliament and the president were the lowest that Iran has ever seen. There's an extreme amount of disillusionment amongst the people of Iran, even those who are supporting the regime and its capabilities and ability to work, which will be kind of touched on in current events and things that are going on that can contribute to that idea that the government maybe isn't able to function. And I think that one aspect of that is seeing the protests that have been happening that have increased over the last decade, especially, but last 5 years. That kind of can hinder that trust. And so voter turnout in 2024 was 41% for the parliamentary election and then 39.3% for the presidential election, which again is its lowest in history. The political culture has a score of 2.5. And it was really interesting. I got the ability to go onto a webinar about Iran and its polarization. And Riza Khanzada from George Mason University has done field work over there and was discussing the political culture over there and how it's really generationally broken up. Generation X and Y have lived through some aspect of the 1979 revolution and the 8-year war with Iraq that followed. And so their viewpoint is going to be shaped by that time and impacted to some extent by that time. And so if there is change, sometimes that change is wanted within the stability of the present regime because they have been through that revolution and they know what war can do when they are experiencing PTSD, even in the present from those moments. Whereas younger generations like Generation Z does not have that PTSD and has only heard the stories of the 1979 revolution and the 8-year war that followed. And so they haven't witnessed that, and they are more likely to want regime change and to want change through another revolution. And then civil liberties has a score of 1.47. Which is really hindered by the way that the state is running the media. The Islamic Republic of Iran broadcasting is the only broadcasting that's allowed and is run by the supreme leader. And one of their missions and purposes is to produce radio, broadcasting news, all of that sort of thing, with information that is going to be supporting the regime. And so it's really skewed in one perspective that is going to be in support of that. And then as Hana is going to be talking about with our gender parity, there are laws that are related to women's freedoms that are hindering them that are then going to be translated into that civil liberties score. So I'll pass it off to Hana.
Hi, so I will be talking today about the Gender Equality Index. And Iran's placement on this is really, really interesting, and there's a variety of reasons for that. And for the first part, I just want to go into what makes up Iran's score. So it is ranked 145 out of 148 countries for gender parity, which is another word for like gender equality. And just for like a kind of frame of reference, Chad is ranked 146, Sudan is ranked 147th, and Pakistan is 104 48th. The Global Gender Gap Report uses 4 different sub-indexes to measure gender equality. And the first one is health and survival. The second one is political participation. The third is economic participation and opportunity. And the fourth is educational attainment. And I'm going to explore a few of those today. And this picture on the right of my slide that you can see, there's these women and they're lined up, they have their IDs, they're getting ready to vote. But as you're going to see, although they have this right to vote, there's a real lack of representation within the government, which I'm going to explore in my next slide. And, as my fellow presenter Abigail mentioned, there's all these different parts of the government, and in each one we can kind of see the limitations women encounter. It's ranked bottom 5 in the world for gender equality. And only 14 women are members of the parliament, the Majlis, out of 290. And so they only make up 6% of the legislative body. Furthermore, they're also limited from the office of supreme leader or president, and the region is the lowest in female empowerment in the world. And this also, there are reasons for this that expand into the judiciary. They have a lot of limitations when it comes to justice because for a couple of things that I'm going to explore, Iran does not criminalize marital rape. It has a very narrow definition of rape to begin with. And for a woman to even prove that she was violated, she needs 4 male witnesses. And the emphasis here is on male witnesses, not female. Their word just doesn't seem to carry the same amount of weight in a courtroom that they would here in America. And Iran also has a really high rate of gender-based violence. And there are even instances where it's legally permitted, such as in Article 630 of the Iranian Penal Code, where if a man encounters his wife cheating on him with another man, he can kill the man that she's cheating on him with and her under law. And from birth, women's lives are worth exactly half of a man's life because there's this sort of blood price that you have to pay, and a woman's price is half of a man's. And there's also the law of Tompkin, which Article 1118 lists that a woman must satisfy her husband's sexual needs or she loses the right for him to pay for her maintenance. So a woman is really financially dependent on her husband, and legally that's enforced. And also there is just an aspect of just a lack of freedom of movement and obstacles women experience with divorce, as some of my fellow presenters are going to explore, and an enforcement of dress code by the morality police. But there's also child marriage, which is a massive problem, where legally girls as young as 13 and boys as young as 15 can be married, but it can be younger if a judge allows or if the male guardian consents. And there's also, again, there's this emphasis on the male guardian, not the female guardian. It doesn't matter what the female guardian might wish for her daughter or her son. And according to official state numbers, in 2017 to 2018, 217 girls under 10 were married, and 35,000 girls that were 10 to 14, and 170 to 290,000 women were married who were 15 to 19 years old. And the thing to keep in mind with this is that these marriages are often in rural areas. They're usually reported later than they actually happen. So the actual ages are probably much younger. And, as my fellow presenter Morgan mentioned, women in Iran are, yes, they're highly educated, they're pushing for change, and they're also extremely literate, but there's been some restriction in that area recently. And as we're going to explore, it's not just gender segregation within different course classes, like a class can only be women or only can be men, which really cuts down on availability of classes for women. But also, it really is restricted by degree. There are certain degrees in universities that are single gendered, which means only one gender can pursue it. And, more than 50% of women can pass the university entrance exam compared to men, which is an incredibly difficult exam, and women make up more than 60% of the student body. But 36 universities have banned women from 77 degrees. Do you want to take a guess of which degrees do you think are banned for women in the chat, like just maybe type up your best guess, like your best idea. You would really think, okay, yeah, engineering, that is one of them. History, yeah, history as well. Yeah, roles in the government. You're so right. There is a limitation that, yeah, government jobs. Political science is one degree that's banned. Nuclear physics, English literature, veterinary medicine, archaeology, general psychology, application of mathematics, business. These are all degrees that are banned to women. And it also further restricts women's financial freedoms, which, as you can see in my other slide about women's like economic opportunity, that's already sort of limited by law, that a husband can, by his own discretion, really be like, well, this job would offend my dignity, my family's dignity, or my wife's dignity, so she can't pursue this specific job. Or it can also include just anything, like anything that it's very purposefully vague. So what a woman could pursue is very like inherently limited. Um, and you also like this is not like the government did not give an express reason for why they were banning specific degrees for women, but they did, it is they have expressed a desire to increase the population. And with like a very like conservative hardline government, it's not a surprise that they've been instituting these changes. And I will be handing it off to my fellow presenter, Morgan, for her to explore reasons.
Hi, I'm going to be finishing up our analysis of political indices with the corruption index. So, the CPI, as pictured here, we have a map of it. It's one of the most widely used global measures for understanding how corruption affects governments. It was started in 1990 by Transparency International, and the CPI has been published annually and trusted around the world. Instead of counting every single corrupt act, which obviously is impossible, it captures how experts and institutions perceive the integrity of a country's public sector. Countries are scored from 0 to 100, with 0 meaning highly corrupt and 100 meaning very clean. The CPI matters because it reflects the overall health of a country's governance, things like transparency, rule of law, accountability, and how public resources are managed. It gives us a really big picture view of whether corruption is isolated or systematic in a country. On this next slide, I'm going to be breaking down Iran's placement on the CPI. It consistently ranks near the bottom. In recent years, it has placed roughly 147th to 151st out of 180, and it puts it among states where corruption is seen as widespread and deeply embedded. This low ranking aligns with a series of high-profile scandals, as pictured here, that have been reinforced perceptions of weak oversight and limited transparency. For example, in 2025, Iranian authorities announced the arrest of over 20 individuals, including judiciary staff, lawyers, and notaries, for participating in a bribery network that manipulated legal outcomes. This trial is seen in the picture here. That same year, officials acknowledged that billions of dollars in medicine subsidies had vanished, coinciding with major drug shortages and price spikes. Other investigations have revealed large-scale fuel theft, no-bid contracts awarded to powerful institutions, and major discrepancies in petrochemical revenues. These cases shape how experts evaluate Iran's governance, and they help explain why the CPI score remains low. On this next slide, we're going to break down the corruption and the significance of it. It has, like, the corruption in Iran has broad consequences that go far beyond individual scandals. At the political level, it reinforces a system where power is concentrated among a small set of elites, military-linked organizations, and state-controlled economic foundations. These groups often operate with limited public oversight, which makes it really difficult to challenge the abuses of power. Economically, corruption drains public resources and distorts markets. Billions are lost through currency manipulation, smuggling networks, as seen pictured here, and unaccounted subsidies that reduce the funds available for healthcare, infrastructure, and social programs. The private sector remains small and constrained, limiting job creation and innovation. For ordinary Iranians, corruption shows up in daily life through higher prices, fewer opportunities, long bureaucratic delays, and uneven access to services. Scandals like the missing medicine funds or the judiciary bribery ring directly affect the public trust, reinforcing the sense that the system does not treat citizens equally. So when Iran scores poorly on the CPI, it's not just a statistic. It reflects a deeper reality that corruption is a structural challenge shaping Iran's politics, economy, and society. Understanding these patterns help explain why corruption remains one of the most significant issues influencing Iran's future. That's it for the political indices. Gonna pass it on to Maura.
Hi, everyone. I just want to quickly go over a comparative analysis of the United States and Iran. I picked the US because hopefully we all have a basis of the freedoms that we are entitled to in the US, and so that way we can better understand the lack of freedoms in Iran. So on this next slide here, you're going to see a very long list. This is a list of illegal activities or actions for women in Iran. And we briefly went over the Iranian Revolution in 1979. I want to focus specifically on March 7th of 1979. This is when Ayatollah Khamenei required mandatory Islamic dress for everyone. And then preceding that, for the next 3 years, women continued to lose jobs and roles in society, especially that of leadership, importance, and in the government specifically. The Iranian government declared that it was all these roles were better suited for men and not for women. Um, and so they continue to lose all of these rights slowly over time. In 1983, the Islamic Penal Code formalized the hijab requirement for all women. If women fail to wear a hijab properly or be dressed according to Quran rules, then they are either going to get 74 lashes or they will be imprisoned for an undisclosed amount of time. And to just better grasp this, I have a few case studies to go over just to show the lack of freedoms compared to the US, for example. So if we go under, and the next slide, we have a picture of Iranian women pre-Islamic Revolution 1960s. I think this photo is incredibly shocking because when we think of Iranian women, this is not what comes to mind. And I think this photo really emphasizes the change that happened post-Iranian Revolution. And these look like these could be American women in the 1960s. So I want to emphasize that women did have the right. This picture was taken in 1962, so this was shortly after women gained the right to vote. Compared to a photo of now, this is the next photo is of 2022 in a women's protest. So clear Islamic dress. This was at a women's protest last March 2022, so a few years ago. But there's a clear difference here. Just legally, women have to dress like this in the streets. On the next slide, I have quite a few case studies that I want to just briefly go over just to showcase the loss of freedoms. So first is the Iranian national women's soccer team. A group of about 9 women were in Australia. They were the national women's soccer team for Iran. They were going to be granted visas, special visas by the Australian government. However, of these 9 women, 8 were forced to return to Iran because their families were being threatened by the government if the women did not return immediately. A Washington Post journalist a few years ago wrote an article speaking out against the Iranian government. He was based in Iran and he was jailed and imprisoned for 4 years following that. Most recently, about a year ago, 3 young adults made a TikTok to Pharrell Williams' Happy, a song that we all hopefully are familiar with. It was a girl with 2 boys. They were not wearing Islamic dress. And all 3 were arrested for illicit acts for being in that video together. And then leaders of the latest Women's March, similar to the photo we just saw, all 7 leaders were arrested. Many were flogged and many were sentenced to death for rebelling against the government. And their fate is unknown because the Iranian government is very secretive about what happens to people they arrest and imprison. And then about 4 or 5 years ago, 2021, a woman was singing in a private performance in Iran. It is illegal for women to sing, so the Iranian government did take her and they did imprison her. And she was charged with solo performance in public, and her fate is, as of right now, unknown. I also want to go over just what protesting looks like in Iran versus the US. So the US, the last major protest was about 3 or 4 weeks ago. It was a major No Kings protest, which is against the government, right? To protest against the current administration. In the US, you have the right to peacefully protest. And so the last major protest had about 8 million protesters, more or less, across 42 states. And there were about 75 arrests. From what I could tell, they were mostly over misconduct versus Iran. Last December, they had a protest against the government that paralleled to the US, except their outcome was very different. They had over 5 million protesters in 17 of 18 districts in Iran, and they had 50,000 arrests and over 7,000 deaths. I do want to quickly note that all of these numbers are released through Iranian news sources that are controlled by the government. So they only filter out what they want us to know. So the real number of protesters, arrests, and deaths might not be fully accurate simply because it's what the government wants the world to know. And I want to also go over current news and events. Many of you might have heard or read about the war in Iran. And if you haven't heard about it or seen about it, you might have felt it when you fuel up your car and realize you're paying a lot more than you used to. So on this next slide here, I have a timeline of just the major key points. If I had to explain how we got to this point, it might be in a completely different presentation. It is a very complicated event, but I would like to go over key facts so that you feel well-versed and confident to explain this to anyone if you needed to. So on February 28th, the US and Israel forces joined together and launched a joint attack on Iran, specifically targeting Iranian leadership, military, and nuclear sites. So just for reference, Iran's nuclear program is very controversial. Since 2003, Iran has repeatedly claimed and told the UN, the United Nations, that they have gotten rid of all their nuclear weapons and program, that they are getting rid of it, and that has been going on from 2003 to November of this year. It is not true, evidently. They have used nukes before, and they did use nukes after Operation Epic Fury, which is the name of the joint US-Israeli attack on Iran. Iran retaliated by sending missiles to US and Israel allies in the Middle East. They hit a lot of military bases. So they hit Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Israel. This was a pretty big deal. It was one of the biggest escalations in the Middle East that we've seen in the past decade, other than the Israel-Hamas war going on right now. So it was very prominent and very major. They attacked a lot of US military bases, and their attacks on their own Middle Eastern allies was kind of caught the entire Middle East a little off guard. So the Iranian government eventually officially reported that the supreme leader was killed on March 1st. This was a big deal because this was the main objective of the initial attack by the US and Israel. And so Iranian government declared that the supreme leader was in fact killed. And then following that, there was like a US attack on an Iranian frigate, which killed 80 Iranian sailors off of the Sri Lankan coast, which was a big deal because that was a big escalation of maritime warfare. And eventually a new supreme leader was unfortunately selected by Iran's government and announced on March 9th. So very, very quickly, within the span of a week, they had a new supreme leader. And then following the selection of this new supreme leader, we see a big escalation of attacks on the Strait of Hormuz. So around March 11th is when we start getting attacks on commercial vessels in the Strait of Hormuz, which is a big deal because out of the Strait of Hormuz, a lot of the world's oil supply goes through and comes out of. So when these vessels started getting attacked, that started worrying, especially U.S. military operations, because the strait is essential for oil deposits everywhere. I mean, the last 2 months have seen over $1 increase in most states when it comes to gas. So very crucial, very important for the world oil supply. Following that tightening of the strait, there was also drone attacks on Gulf countries. Again, it also hit a bunch of the previously attacked Middle Eastern countries very aggressively, resulted in many deaths throughout these countries, not only of US military personnel, but also civilian casualties, specifically in Bahrain and Israel, were hit quite hard when it came to civilian casualties. Following this, there was a US air refueler that shot down. There was a very impressive 3-day rescue mission that made news to rescue the pilots of this downed air refueler. Thankfully, they were all rescued by the US military. And then from March 13th to April 7th, there's a bit of a gap on my timeline. Here is just back and forth of Israel-US attacks on Iran and Iran retaliating. So this was kind of a back and forth moment. Obviously, it's a war, so there is a lot of fighting going on in this time period. But what I really want to focus on is the immediate ceasefire that was announced April 7th. So this was a big deal because this was mediated by Pakistan to negotiate peace between Iran, Israel, and the US. Unfortunately, this did not last very long. One of Iran's terms and one of their conditions was that Israel also halt their attack on Lebanon, which they have been attacking for a few months now over Hezbollah, which is a terrorist group stationed there. And Israel did attack Lebanon, so Iran claimed that this was a violation of their treaty. And yesterday, the US announced that all ceasefire talks had collapsed. The Associated Press released a statement saying that the ceasefire talks have completely collapsed and that there's really no hope for negotiations. As of 1 hour ago, when I last read the news, the US has announced a complete blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. So what that means is the US is going to line up their Navy vessels along the Iranian ports to hopefully protect commercial vessels coming in and out. So hopefully that will lower our gas prices in the next coming weeks. And they're trying to use that to leverage Iran back to the table. As of right now, nothing's happened, but they have announced that the blockade does come into effect today. So hopefully that just catches everyone up, and it's just a really brief breakdown of everything that's been going on in the world so far with Iran. So for our final takeaway, I'd love to hand it over to Ella.
Thank you, Nora. That was a great explanation. We're now going to do our final takeaways. When we step back and look at Iran's history, political institutions, and social indicators together, a broader pattern emerges. Iran today operates within a theocratic authoritarian regime where elections exist, but ultimately authority remains concentrated in religious leadership and unelected political institutions. This system was created during the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and continues to shape the country's political and social landscape today. Political systems influence everyday life in several important ways. First, limited political freedoms can affect how citizens perceive their ability to influence government decisions. When individuals feel that political participation does not significantly affect policy outcomes, political alienation can increase. Second, economic pressures also shape national well-being. Iran has experienced years of economic challenges, including international sanctions, inflation, and unemployment. These conditions affect material living standards and economic stability. Third, social regulations, particularly those affecting women, can influence perceptions of personal autonomy. Laws governing dress codes, family law, and social behavior can shape the everyday experiences of many Iranian citizens, especially women. However, Iran's society is not defined solely by these challenges. Iran also demonstrates remarkable social resilience. Family networks, cultural traditions, and strong community relationships remain central parts of their social life. These connections provide emotional support and stability even during periods of political and even economic instability. This helps explain why Iran's happiness rankings falls in the middle of the global rankings rather than at the bottom. In many ways, Iran represents a society where strong social structures coexist, but with political constraints. As we conclude this presentation, it's important to return to the central question we began with. How do political systems influence human well-being? Iran provides a compelling case study for this question. The country's political system, created after the 1979 revolution, continues to shape the opportunities, freedoms, and institutional structures that influence everyday life. Through indicators such as the World Happiness Report, the Democracy Index, the Gender Equality Index, and the Corruption Perception Index, we can see how governance affects not only political outcomes but also citizens' evaluations of the quality of their lives. Iran's position in global well-being rankings reflects a complex reality. The country faces political restrictions, economic challenges, and social regulations that can limit personal autonomy. At the same time, strong cultural traditions, family networks, and community ties continue to support resilience within the Iranian society. Recent events such as the protests following the death of Mahsa Amini highlight how many citizens, particularly women, continue to advocate for greater autonomy and dignity. The slogan that emerged from these protests, "Women, Life, Freedom," has become a powerful symbol of aspirations for social and political change within the country. Ultimately, Iran reminds us that political systems shape far more than institutions and policies. They shape how people experience freedom, opportunity, and dignity in their everyday lives. And while political development is rarely linear, history shows that societies are constantly evolving. The future of Iran will likely continue to be shaped by the interaction between political institutions and social movements, and of course, especially the aspirations of its people. Now I will hand it off to Hana to end our presentation with our Q&A. Thanks for listening.
So I just want to invite everyone to post any questions in the chat that you have. And if I can't help answer the question, I'd be happy to pass it off to one of my presenters. I see your question, Clarissa. Okay. Yeah, I was also really surprised by the limitations women experience. It was really sobering to read the Iranian Penal Code and just understand the amount of just obstacles women face to having any kind of justice at all in those situations. Um, and okay, Caleb, what do we foresee with the conflict with Iran? I want to pass this off to my presenter, Nora, who's been keeping up to date for the current events.
Thank you, Hana. Um, as any time we have a war, it's hard to predict what's going to happen. From what I can tell, the next step would probably be to implement some type of ceasefire. Although the last one fell through within 4 days, perhaps the US blockade will create more of a leverage for Iran. And outside of that, I really don't know, to be honest. A lot of things could happen. We could see the restructuring of government, but in order to do that, they would have to keep targeting Iranian leadership. And as we've seen, when they cut off one end of the snake, another grows in its place, as the new supreme leader was just selected. So it's very complicated, and I personally do not know if this will drag out for a bit longer and how far US and Israel really want to go, as it is already affecting the global economy quite severely. So sorry if that didn't fully answer your question, but that's from what I could tell from the news.
Axel, you asked what stood out most to us. I think that for me, I already understood to some level what women experience in Iran because I have a friend who's Iranian, who's a woman, and just her experience of like moving overseas and the freedoms she had after doing that opened my eyes to what women had. But I didn't know the depths of like that, those limitations and like how hard it actually was to live as a woman there, let alone the educational restrictions. But I also want to see what some of my fellow presenters think about this question. Ella, what was something that stood out most to you when you were learning about this?
I think what stood out to me the most, and what really does with everyone, that when they research Iran is like the marital laws, I think, is really what stood out to me. I've known about it before, but even just Hana talking about it and like talking about how like there are actually like quite a few young girls that were like married off to men that I'm guessing are of older age is just a crazy thing to, like to wrap your head around. And I just thought that was like obviously like really important that we added that into the conversation of this whole presentation. And I think that stood out to me the most because it just like upsets me and it's just crazy to hear that. But that's all I have for that. Morgan, do you have any thoughts or feelings on the question?
Something that really stood out to me was like when I was researching the corruption in Iran, it was like recent scandals, and there were plenty to choose from. There was about 10 that popped up that I couldn't include, but it was pretty much every aspect. It was crazy.
Yeah, and we got another question about if there's anything that we've learned about Iran that we think is better than the systems or culture in the US. And I think um, one of my presenters did such a good job about the happiness index. I was so surprised to learn about the deep, like familial connection. I feel like as our culture in the US, we're very individualistic, and that's amazing and that's wonderful. It's one of the things that makes our country great. But I think sometimes we've shifted so far from like kind of a Gemeinschaft society that we are at risk of isolating ourselves. And I think that as was mentioned, like one reason that their happiness score is higher is because of those social connections. So I think we can learn from the Iranians with this. And I also want to pass it off to my presenter, Nora, to add to this.
Thanks, Hannah. There's this notion in Iran called taraf, which is this idea that Iranian hospitality is legendary. They are very hospitable, which is kind of it's an interesting contradiction, I think, when they have such strict laws on freedoms, but they are known to be very hospitable because they are an Islamic state. And the Quran is kind of specific when it comes to hospitality. You're supposed to be hospitable towards visitors and towards your neighbors, even though they're so strict on women and on certain rights and freedoms, they are also supposed to follow the Quran, and the Quran says to be hospitable. So I thought that was really interesting that this nation is known to be very open with their neighbors and uh, like creating this sense of community and uh, family um, within their borders, which is a really fascinating thing. And the U.S. sometimes is really hospitable and sometimes isn't. So I thought it was a really, really interesting case study where like they have to follow the Quran, so they have to be hospitable.
Yeah, and Braylon, you asked us if we found any positive aspects about the culture in our research, and I think I can add on to this with just like there is just this incredible richness of culture that goes back just centuries and centuries, and so much history and so much literature and just even the food, if I could say that, like just incredible food. Like I am so excited to explore Iranian cuisine more. Like I am more excited to read more Iranian poetry. I've been reading a really interesting book recently about like the women life freedom movement and the poems collected from with that revolution. And like I think that kind of leads into our next question from George. How does Iran's gender laws compare to the average standards of the Islamic world? Have there ever been pushes for reform or liberalization inside the Iranian government? I have not seen a lot of evidence of pushes for reform within the government for reform and liberalization, but I think that's where I want to hand it off to Abigail, my fellow presenter, because she did more research on this.
Yeah, so I can't entirely speak to other Islamic countries. I don't know that I'm as familiar with for one thing, the intricacies of the Islamic law, especially within Iran, just because they have so many articles. I know Hana mentioned some in the 1000s. So for me, keeping track of all of those has been difficult. And I looked more at the broader structures of that. So I don't know if there is, by any other panelists, any more familiarity within gender laws across the Islamic world. But I know that there has been some slight shifts throughout the government. I know that coming out of the 1990s and reading about the judiciary and the abolishment of the office of the prosecutor in 2008, I believe that you had some reformists in the government who were coming through and trying to help restore that office to have some sort of betterment of the judiciary, but it is still like with a great absence of due process and fair trials, even with the office of the prosecutor back. And I know that the current president is in the Reformist Party and faction, and so I know that there has been some hope because the prior president who died in the helicopter crash had been a hardliner conservative, and so it was almost a shock that there was such low voter turnout, and then the result was a reformist. So I know that there is some extent of hope, but even within that reformist faction, it's still very pushing for the idea of the Islamic Republic. So.
Yeah, and I want to add on to that about Iran's gender laws because now that I think about it, Indonesia has a huge amount of Muslim population, but the way that they enforce different laws and social norms that are based on the Quran is very different and much more, I wouldn't say relaxed because there's a deep respect and honor for it within the culture, but it's much less harsh. There's, especially in urban areas, you won't run into the same type of like morality police and stuff. And I also want to answer a question, a great question from Edward. It seems like corruption plays a large role in stunting the growth and help for the people of Iran. With this war and current regime, it would be interesting to see how corruption would be affected. Do you think that Iran's corruption is going to change in the coming years? I'd like to pass this off to my presenter, Morgan, because she helped explore that.
Yeah, so when I was looking at the patterns of corruption in Iran, they've been in war before, and unfortunately, this corruption pattern hasn't changed. They consistently rank. I think the highest score possible for the AI in Iran was 147th out of 182 countries. And that puts them in a category of highly corrupt every single year since 1990. And as we looked at the timeline earlier, we've seen them in the Iran-Iraq war. We've seen this pattern isn't changing. I think that the only way to combat this corruption would be to change the political system that they currently have.
I'm going to start wrapping up the Q&A. So I'm just going to answer one more question from Sydney about, have you seen the Iranian Lego propaganda videos against the United States? And if so, what do you think of this strategy? I'm going to give this to my presenter, Nora, to expand on.
Great question. I personally have seen these. For those of you who have not seen these are AI generated Lego propaganda videos that kind of show created by the Iranian government that show the U.S. Attacking Iran, and it's littered with misinformation and unfactual information. What's really interesting, I was just reading an article by the BBC on these, is that it's weirdly an effective method of propaganda, not only because it relates to Iranian audiences, creating this different narrative that Iran, like the US and Israel, are solely to blame for the conflict. But it also reaches Western audiences because Lego is a universal language. It's something that mostly everyone in the world has seen or knows about. So depicting war in this format has seen a weirdly big audience, and Western audiences can be manipulated with this language. So that's really interesting, and it's an interesting modern wartime propaganda method. So yeah, great question.
And with that, I'm going to wrap up our Q&A. I want to thank you guys for being such active participants and for all of your questions. You were incredible. I want to thank my fellow presenters for the great job they did answering it. I'm going to pass it off to the next presenter.
Okay, thank you all so much for coming. I know it's hard in the middle of the day, but we are so grateful for your support to Vanguard's History and Political Science program. We hope you learned something new, and if you want to keep up with us, we have our Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube, so you can connect with us, see what we're coming up with, and thank you for coming, and yeah, I hope you learned something.